Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our Geezerology Roundtable. Today, we're going to double back on Jimi Hendrix, who we discussed a few weeks ago with Hendrix in the West. Well, we're going to double back and go back to the debut album by the Jimi Hendrix Experience called Are You Experienced? This album was released in a couple of different configurations in 1967. It first appeared in the US, it first appeared in the United Kingdom on May 12th, 1967 on Track Records, which was a small independent label. And the album was a pretty quick success there in the United Kingdom. Hendrix had been building up a pretty good fan base in London after he left the United States to go there. And Chandler from the Animals got a hold of Hendrix and became his manager and pretty much got his career going for him. But Hendrix had not yet at this time found an audience in the United States, and the first single that was released in the UK, when it was released in the US on May the 1st, Hey Joe, the single just tanked. It went nowhere. And so they were still trying to figure out how to get Hendrix, some sort of a fan base, some sort of following in the United States. Well, Paul McCartney, in the meantime, the Monterey Pop Festival was getting organized, and they approached Paul McCartney to see if the Beatles wanted to play the Monterey Pop Festival, and McCartney said no. But McCartney told him about this guitar player that he'd been listening to named Jimi Hendrix. McCartney was a big fan, and Pete Townsend jumped in and pushed him. So the Monterey Pop Festival decided to go ahead and book Hendrix, and that happened in June of 1967, a month after the album was released in the UK. And then we all know what happens at the Monterey Pop Festival. Hendrix pretty much stole the show, and that's how Jimi was introduced to the U.S. and started building his audience here and started getting a little bit of buzz about him. So Reprise Records jumped in, and they agreed to release the album Are You Experienced in a little bit different configuration. They changed the track listing a little bit and moved some things around. And Hendrix didn't like the cover that was on the album in the UK, so he had the cover redone for the US release. And Are You Experienced was finally released here in the US on August 23rd, 1967. It became a pretty good hit in the US, and the rest, as they say, is rock and roll history, right? So anyway, the three of us are going to talk about the US version of Are You Experienced, and I'll hand it off to Bob to get this discussion started.
All right. Thank you, Scotty. Back several months ago, you and I did a program where we talked about some of our top debut albums, and I picked Are You Experienced as one of my three best debut albums. And there's nothing that I can say about Hendrix and the Jimi Hendrix Experience that millions of other writers or critics haven't already said. So I'm just going to relate some of my personal feelings about this thing. There are 11 songs on this album, and you're looking at Purple Haze, Manic Depression, Hey Joe, I Don't Live Today, The Wind Cries Mary, Fire, Foxy Lady, Are You Experienced? As one person wrote, this is almost like a greatest hits album just by itself. And I think every song on this album is good. The weakest one, I think, is Third Stone from the Sun. The spoken lyrics kind of turned me off a little bit, and there's just some weird distortion stuff going on. But other than that, every song on this album is great. And, this was a milestone in rock music. And we all recognize Hendrix for his very unique guitar playing. But what I think gets overlooked sometimes is how good a songwriter he was, and actually a very, very good vocalist. And all of that comes forth on this album. He wrote every song except for Hey Joe, which is a cover. And a few background things on this album that I think also help point out its greatness. The Jimi Hendrix Experience had only been together for 2 or 3 weeks before they started recording this album. And, Hendrix had gone to England. He met Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell 2 or 3 weeks before they went into the studio and started recording. So they didn't really even have time, to be a cohesive unit. But that speaks to how great they were that they were able to put this material out. And the album was done on like a shoestring budget. Chandler didn't have money to continuously record, so they would sneak into the studio in between, the group performing at various clubs and stuff in England. And then he finally convinced a record company to give them some backing. So the recording of this album took place over like about a 5-month period. So those factors also put in there, I think, lend some credence, just to how great this thing was. And I want to relate a couple personal things about the album. When I was in high school, I was buddies with a guy that played guitar in a garage band. And I was hanging out with the band one night at this house, and they were playing, and they were halfway through Purple Haze, and there was a storm, going on, and power got knocked out. So the whole neighborhood's blacked out, and the band loses power right in the middle of Purple Haze. And us being teenagers under the influence of various herbs and things, somebody, and I don't remember who, was like, wow, man, we just invoked the spirit of Hendrix. So that's one of my teenage memories of this. The other one, the song Purple Haze, for decades and decades, I thought Purple Haze was about LSD or acid, because at one time there was a brand of acid going around called Purple Haze. And that's what I thought the song was about. But it's actually, Jimi Hendrix was a science fiction fan, and he got the idea for the song from a book, a science fiction book, where there is a purple haze around the planet that causes people to be disoriented. So that's where the purple haze came from. And when it talks about "Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky," and Purple Haze actually started out as a much longer song, but got shortened for the album. And so I think it's one of the best debut albums out there, and it's stood up consistently over the decades it's been out there. And it's hard to imagine that this thing is more than 50 years old, because to me, it still sounds fresh. It still sounds innovative. And Hendrix is out there by himself. And anybody who comes along afterward who sounds like Hendrix, they're labeled as copycats. You can be influenced by somebody else and copy their style, but if you copy Hendrix style, you suffer from an attack of plagiarism. Robin Trower got bogged down in that when he did Bridge of Sighs. So I think it's a fantastic album. The songs are great. Hendrix was a great songwriter, and you still hear so many cuts off this album still out there in rotation, on classic radio, and they to me don't get old. So those are my thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, just a side note before I turn it over to Dee, just to follow up on a couple things you said. Now, the tracks Purple Haze, Hey Joe, and The Wind Cries Mary were not on the UK edition of this album. They were all released as singles, as non-album singles in the UK, and then when Reprise Records agreed to release this in the United States, they insisted that those songs be on the album. So what was cut from the original UK version was Red House. Red House did not make the US album. A song called Can You See Me was not on the US album. And another one, a song called Remember, which was on the UK album, did not make it to the North American edition of the album. Those three tracks eventually did appear on later posthumous Hendrix albums, but anyway, I just wanted to toss that in. So the three big hits from this album really were not on the original version of the album.
Yeah, all of those songs plus some others are on the deluxe version of our
Right. When they re-released
Right.
like a some sort of remastered version or something, and they added bonus tracks. They added all those songs as bonus tracks, as along with a few others, I think.
The version I'm looking at here on Apple Music actually has 18 tracks.
Correct.
The original album had 11. So
Correct. D, what do you remember about Are You Experienced?
Well, I had Are You Experienced initially not on vinyl, but on 8-track tape. And I played the hell out of it in my car and got, very familiar with it. And, this LP, when it was released, was in 1967, was sort of a string of psychedelic flavored albums released by other groups, Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, primarily.
Sergeant Pepper's.
And Sergeant Pepper's.
That year, yep.
Yeah, and I think what's fairly amazing about it is all these, people, they're in different studios. This is, before social media, before this, and they're just working in their own little musical silos, and yet, there is a theme that comes out of this. And of course, I think one of the ingredients in this, if you want to call this a psychedelic cake mix, is, of course, either the inspiration or the use of mind expanding drugs. And I'll leave it for people to say if that helped with the songwriting and maybe ideas or not. I'm after all these years, I'm a little bit neutral on it, although I think it may help open a door, but at the end of the day, you still have to have the talent to carry it off and to see the end of your musical vision. And some of my favorite songs on here, of course, Foxy Lady, Fire, love that one. I even like Third Stone from the Sun because it's kind of more so the instrumental. The spoken word part was a little bit, I could have done without that, but I like the extended solo in that one. And of course, probably my favorite after all this time is The Wind Cries Mary. I think it's got the arrangement. It's got some of his best lyrics, I think. And I have to say, though, the one song, if I never hear it again, that's fine with me. And I put it in the same category now as Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, and there's a couple others out there, is Purple Haze. Yes, it's got an iconic riff, and I loved it in its day, but a couple of years ago, I was flipping radio stations on the way back from Farmington, Missouri, or wherever I was driving. And I thought, here it comes again. And I thought, I really can't listen to that song anymore. It's
been overplayed over the last 50 years. Is that your issue with it?
Yeah. And even, when I'd go to local clubs and they did the obligatory Hendrix song, they always do Purple Haze, but you could pull off Purple Haze because it has that memorable that riff to it. And and it's in my youth, it was a great song, but like Bob alluded to, I thought it was drug inspired in all this. And then I came across too that Hendrix was a fan of science fiction, and he got some of his inspiration, and it shows in his lyrics, I think, which Foxy Lady and some of the others portray. Now, you mentioned at the beginning that, Hendrix, prior to going over to England, and I think he felt he had to, he was sort of tired of playing on the rhythm and blues circuit in the South. And it's, been already talked about for a long time that he toured with the Isley Brothers, Little Richard. So he had a sense of, playing blues, soul, and a sense of showmanship. So he goes over there and make a little shorthand here. He gets discovered by Chaz Chandler, one of the founders of the Animals, who I think was certainly a guiding light for Hendrix. He got him the studio time and all this. And they released, no, they were, as Bob mentioned, they were working on some of the tracks, and they did some touring around England and Europe. And in between the breaks in the tour, they run back to the studio. So that was the reason it took about, I think, 4 months. They started in 1966, and I think it was finished in early 67. You know, what can you say about his mark on rock and roll history? If you talk to guitar players, there's before Hendrix and after Hendrix, although there have been others who have their own styles and put their own mark on it. Definitely. I mean, you know, you could make a case for Eddie Van Halen. He took it to another evolution, but Hendrix was the whole package. And I don't think we'll see his likes again. And one other thing, a side note I came across, it was in the final song, Are You Experienced? And he uses he uses distortion as an instrument in this album. And he uses tape loops and a backward solo. And I've read where he was influenced by the Beatles' song Tomorrow Never Knows, which used those same effects on the Revolver album.
Right.
Backward solo
from 1966.
Hey, yeah, and that makes perfect sense because that album right there was sort of just pushing the door open into experimenting with psychedelic songs. But
right.
So I'll just say Jimmy let his freak flag fly, and it's still flying in circles of guitarists around the world.
Yeah, this was recorded over, Wikipedia has it from October 23rd, 1966 to April 4th, 1967. So that's what, 6 or 7 months, somewhere in there. And they used 3 different studios in London. So I guess it was just, whatever studio was available when they were ready to go in and record is where they used. Just to go back to Chaz Chandler, I think Chaz Chandler was probably the I don't know, would you call him a Svengali?
A mentor.
Well, not more than a mentor. Chaz Chandler was the one that put this all together. I mean, Chaz Chandler recruited Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding. Chaz Chandler got the recording contracts. Chaz Chandler got him out on the road. Chaz Chandler got him in Monterey Pop, and Chaz Chandler pretty much guided, was a dominant force in Hendrix's career for the rest of his life, for his entire life. I mean, Chandler was the guy.
Chandler was the architect.
Chandler was the architect, exactly, and Chandler is is credited as the sole producer on this album. Chandler was everything.
The story that I read was, that Chandler was wanting to move into management and production,
right,
and that Hendrix was playing in a club in New York City, and Keith Richards' girlfriend was in the audience, and was awestruck by Hendrix, and that she recommended to Chandler that he take this guy on. So you're right, Scott. They get Hendrix to England, and it's just Hendrix by himself with nothing else.
Yeah.
And from there, Chandler made everything happen for him. Yeah. And some other things that I read in kind of researching for this, like when we talk about the Doors and their debut album, they had worked up a lot of their material on stage, playing at the Whiskey A Go-Go and other clubs. And so when they went into the studio, they already had these songs worked out. Here, the Jimi Hendrix Experience worked up these songs in the studio. I mean, they didn't have an opportunity to be on the stage. And from what I read, there were times when Hendrix would have written the song and they went in either the same day or the very next day and just did them on the fly. So again, it harks back to how good these 3 people were together, that they could work this stuff up in the studio and not have an opportunity to really work it up, on stage.
Are you? Yeah, I don't know, because I wasn't there, and I'm not a big scholar of Jimi Hendrix or anything like that. So I don't know, but I want to bring up a little argument with you here. You keep
Okay.
saying you're talking about how they work together as a unit and everything like that. I don't really think that was it at all. I think this was all Hendrix. This is all Hendrix. I don't see where Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding did much here. I mean, they just kind of learned their parts and played them. I don't know if they were involved in any creativity or anything. And in fact, it wasn't too long after that where, see, because Noel Redding wasn't even a bass player. Noel Redding was a guitar player, and Chandler found him, and Chandler gave him the gig, and he switched to the bass just so he could get this gig. He wasn't really a bass player. And in fact, after he and Hendrix parted ways, because Hendrix didn't like him as a bass player, and probably because he really wasn't very creative or very good at it or anything like that. And Hendrix booted him. Hendrix stuck around with Mitch Mitchell, but he replaced Noel Redding pretty quickly with Billy Cox, right? But anyway, I mean, that's neither here nor there. That's just kind of my take on the other two guys. This is officially not a Jimi Hendrix album. It's a Jimi Hendrix Experience album. So it's an album by the band, not by the guy. But there are some instances where you can say that the band was the guy. One of them that we're going to be talking about, fairly soon, Jethro Tull is an example of that. One we talked about recently, Joe Jackson, that was an example of that. And there are others that are obviously, ensemble and bands like the Doors. The Doors weren't just Jim Morrison, but I think the Jimi Hendrix Experience was Jimi Hendrix. That's just my take on it. I'm not saying I'm not arguing with you because I think you're wrong. I'm just saying that's my take on it. I've never been a big fan of Jimi Hendrix or the Jimi Hendrix Experience. I've always been more of a casual fan, and it's been a while since I listened to this record. I listened to it a few times in the last year, and it's like it to me, it doesn't hold up at all. To me, it just sounds like something that came out in 1967, and it's all just kind of become it's a good historical artifact in my opinion. Not anything great shapes. I mean, obviously it was a landmark album when it came out, as a lot of albums were in 1967 in that time period. I mean, Doors are just being kicked down like crazy by a whole lot of people during this time, and this was one of them. This was one of the more impactful ones out of all of those. And I have no argument with that. I have no argument with Jimi Hendrix was probably the greatest guitar player who ever lived. I have no argument that this is one of the best debut albums ever recorded. It's just not something that I enjoy listening to now. I used to enjoy listening to it. I don't anymore. Part of it, I think, from what Dee was saying with Purple Haze, is that so many of these songs on here are just been overdone like crazy for the last few years by classic rock radio, and I'm just done with it. Stairway to Heaven, Foxy Lady, Purple Haze, you just take them all and put them in a vault somewhere, and if I never heard them again, I'd be happy. I agree with Bob that I think Hendrix was his reputation is as this great, fantastic, innovative guitar player. I think still today, and he was back then, and still today, I think he was a very underrated songwriter. He was a very underrated overall musician, and I think he was good. I like his voice. I think he had a very good singing voice, but people don't go back to that. I liked his I liked his straight pop slash rock songs, whatever you want to call them. You know, more of the mainstream stuff without all the guitar accoutrements. I like those simpler rock songs that he recorded a lot more than I like some of these workouts. Like, you know, he could put together a great 4-minute rock song. I thought, you know, it's when he lost me on, you know, when he started going on all these guitar noodlings and things like that. It just wasn't, you know, I understand the greatness of it. It just wasn't something that appealed to me. But anyway, that's my take on it for what it's worth. You know, I'm not offering this as any sort of expert on Jimi Hendrix, because I'm not. It's just I'm just saying that I don't think he was overrated. I just never really got into him too much, except for a few of his 4-minute rock songs that I would hear on the radio, the ones that weren't overplayed. You know, we'll get into a few of those later. His subsequent 2 albums I like a lot better than this one, actually, just because they're more in my taste. But yeah, Jimi Hendrix. Wow, it's been a long time. He'd been gone over 50 years, and he sure left his mark on the world, didn't he?
Yeah, I would. I have a little bit different take on this. I still, to this day, I am not tired of this music. It still sounds fresh to me. And yes, I know that it's a staple on classic rock radio. And like I said earlier, you know, almost every one of the songs off this album is still in rotation. But I'm never tired of listening to it. To me, you know, 50 plus years later, it still sounds fresh. And I can listen to it today with as much enthusiasm as I did, you know, back in the day. The only thing that's changed is now that I know what Purple Haze is actually about. To me, that was always the song that epitomized the drug culture of 1967. You know, along with
wrong.
And to me, it was like Purple Haze, and
it gives you a whole different perspective.
Give me a whole different perspective on it, and it's not that it was like, oh, okay, cool. He was inspired by a science fiction. I like that, but it used to be the song of the psychedelic drug culture, and along with White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. Yeah. And now it doesn't have that meaning for me anymore. But no, I still love listening to this stuff. I'm not tired of it to this day.
We'll move further with Jimi Hendrix experience. We'll get into Axis Bold as Love a little bit later, and eventually into Electric Ladyland a little bit later. But yeah, I don't think there's any question that this is a incredibly significant masterpiece of an album. Just not one I enjoy listening to anymore. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Come back on Friday. On Friday this week is we'll finally get Bob's review of Dave Grohl's book. That's up this Friday. And next week we're going to return to our look at Creedence Clearwater Revival, and go with Green River next week, their second album, their follow-up to their debut. That'll be next Tuesday. So thanks for joining us, everybody. We appreciate it. Appreciate your time, and we will talk to you soon. So long.
Take care.